Hey, everybody, welcome back to the podcast daily. This is Thursday, May 11th. I'm Bill Landis. That's Jeremy Birmingham. Austin Ward is somewhere gallivanting around Epcot, I'd imagine. At this point, who knows what that guy's up to down in Orlando. So you have to deal with Berm and I today as we discuss the addition of Tywone Malone, defensive tackle from Ole Miss, who I'm sure a lot of Ohio State fans are familiar with the Buckeyes recruiting him out of high school in the class of 2021. Berm, this was a little bit of a drawn-out process, I think, and it did seem to kind of go back and forth a little bit as to whether Tywone would ultimately pick Ohio State or perhaps Miami. It seemed like those were the top two programs. I guess maybe like how did you see this play out? And I don't know, how did you see like the two schools kind of go back and forth against each other as Tywone was trying to figure out what he was going to do?
I think it's pretty clear Miami was trying to sell the idea that he could walk into Coral Gables and be a starting defensive tackle for them. Ohio State's path to playing time is a little bit more crowded, but there is a belief from people at the Woody Hayes Athletic Center that if Tywone Malone is what they thought he was when they were recruiting him in the summer of 2020, that he can compete for a starting job. Not necessarily that's going to be guaranteed like it probably would be at Miami, but there is an opportunity for it. And regardless of whether or not he starts, because we saw how much Larry Johnson rotates his defensive linemen anyway, there's going to be an opportunity for a lot of reps and meaningful reps for a guy that has 12 tackles in his first 2 years of college football. So it's not like he's leaving one program where he was the primary guy and then expecting to be the starter somewhere else. I think he still realizes that splitting his time the last 2 years between football and baseball has left him a little bit incomplete when it comes to being a defensive tackle ready for the rigors of big time college football. But now that you're putting baseball to the side, there's no real reason to, and this is not meant to be a slap at Miami or whatever, but why settle for a program that's not as good when you have 1 to 2 years to try to put yourself in a position to get drafted for the NFL. And Malone's 6'4", 305 pounds, big kid, obviously a good enough athlete to play 2 Division I sports in the SEC. Like, he's got the physical tools. Now it's just about the refinement and that kind of stuff. And I think that ultimately all the reasons he liked Ohio State in the beginning, which Larry Johnson, the ability to develop defensive linemen, the way Johnson is with pass rushers, et cetera, like all those reasons were still there for him as he went into the transfer portal. So if you remove baseball from the equation, which is the one piece that back in 2020 probably led him to making the decision he did going to Ole Miss, that it sort of became a no-brainer, I think. And the debate in the last 2 weeks, Bill, seemed like what was important to him. Was it going to be NIL? Was it going to be opportunity? Was it going to be a combination of both? And I think that's where when he left campus 2 weeks ago after his visit to Ohio State, there was some consternation on the Buckeye side, like, well, we got to figure out what his priorities are. And over the last 10 days, clearly those came, clear for Malone.
The no baseball thing is interesting to me now because when you watch him, like you can see the flashes, I think, of how good he can be as a defensive tackle. But, the idea of like splitting your time between 2 sports, and especially like I think he had like, I don't know, a handful of at-bats playing for the Ole Miss baseball team. Like he didn't seem like a player whom the baseball team kind of saw as like an integral part of their program moving forward. It was just like, sure, if it means we can get you to play football, then you can come take a couple ABs and play baseball for us. But that was probably very much to Tywone's detriment, I would imagine. And now the idea of him being able to focus solely on football is very intriguing to me. I mean, as you said, he's 6'4", 305. He's really long. Like he was like a defensive end and tackle in high school. And I guess like you don't see too many defensive ends in a 4-3 in particular playing that look like him. But he played on the edge at Ole Miss, and he was okay there. Like the stats don't jump off the page at you, but if you watch a couple of plays, you can definitely see the vision there for him or the ceiling for him. And I can't help but think that moving from a 3-4 end to a 4-3 defensive tackle, now going against more centers and guards and being able to use that length and athleticism that maybe sometimes wasn't always an advantage for him playing against offensive tackles, I think that can really take his game to another level. So when you kind of combine all that, it feels like a no-brainer for me for Ohio State as long as they can make the numbers work, and clearly they think they can. But you tweeted something, Berm, when this announcement was made by Tywone that the value of not burning bridges and maintaining relationships, and clearly a strong one was built the first time around when Ohio State was recruiting him. And sometimes that carries over, and sometimes we might think that it's obvious that it would carry over for other players, and it didn't. Why do you think it did in this particular case?
Because Malone, I think there's two avenues, right? When you're building a relationship with schools that are recruiting you, the value or the relationship strength that these kids have with position coaches is much different than the relationship that they grow with head coaches. Ultimately, especially on the second time around in the transfer portal, the relationship with the head coach is what matters, because Ryan Day is the one that has to make that final decision to say yes or no, we're going to bring this kid in. In a relationship and a recruitment like Malone's, even though he chose Ole Miss, he was very upfront with Ohio State early and often throughout his recruitment of what was going to be the deciding factor for him. Ohio State had him on campus for an official visit. They were very close to that conversation and routinely said, hey, if football is where you're going, let us know. And until he decided that he was for sure going to play baseball, I think he was probably leaning toward Ohio State. So, but he did it the right way, which was not to say, screw you, or I'm gonna say I'm committing to you, and then I'm gonna boat somewhere else. And Ryan Day has shown in the last couple of years that he is extremely concerned about like the character of someone to say I'm coming and then to turn their back and walk away from it. I think that obviously Tywone Malone did not do that, and the relationship never soured. Again, Ohio State's done this a few times in the last few years. I mean, it started with Trey Sermon, with Tony Alford. I mean, that relationship matters so much for recruits and high school athletes that are listening to that. Like, there's no reason that you can't maintain a level of real respect and relationship with coaches that aren't your own. Like, it doesn't have to turn into a embittered feud. You can pretty much move on, say, hey, let's shake hands as men and say we never know when they're going to run into each other again. And could be in the NFL, could be at another college, but you certainly see the difference in the way that this was handled as opposed to, other names that we've talked about through the last few months in the transfer portal, where people are like, oh, well, why isn't Ohio State going after this guy? Like, it's not, it's not apples to apples.
Yeah, I mean, they've done it before, and it'll be interesting to see if they do it more. Larry Johnson has done this before, to be more specific.
Yeah, Antoine Jackson, right?
Yeah, right. So I think it speaks to his ability to build relationships, and as like some of us, when I say some of us, I mean us, and probably me and Austin maybe a little more than you, like, question Larry's ability to do that stuff as consistently as he did a few years ago. I think this is a reminder that he still got it a little bit. He still got that fastball, I think, when Ohio State needs it. And this is a big pickup for him. There's two things, Berm, that this kind of addition leads me to. One is about the defensive line. I'll put a pin in that for a second. The first is, so he's involved with Miami. We know that the way that Miami sort of goes about its business in this NIL era, some folks involved on the NIL side with Ohio State, I think, were not so subtly celebrating this addition. What are we to make of what this means, if anything, in terms of Ohio State's competitiveness in the NIL space when it comes to adding transfers and recruits?
I mean, it feels like this offseason has been a sign that Ohio State has sort of figured things out, at least a little bit. I do personally wish it was not done in that way. I'm just not a fan of Twitter gloating. I don't understand it. I think that it always leads to being, it always comes back around in some level, and I think it's better off just to handle it, as professionally as possible. But this is the world we live in. But clearly, Ohio State is figuring things out and figuring out how to balance. And what I really believe is that there are still some people in the program who, when a player comes and the conversation is about NIL, immediately want to write that off and say, well, this player isn't for us. It's not really what we're looking for. It's not the culture we want. But when you start to realize that you can, as one of the few programs in the country like Ohio State is, that has the ability to attack this from both sides, like, not only does Ohio State have, more NFL draft picks than anybody in the last 20 years, or Larry Johnson as your defensive line coach, or all of the opportunities that come from an Ohio State degree and the connections nationally, but now they're all able to say, hey, we also are as competitive as anyone on the NIL front for players on the roster. And that's the important thing to underscore. It's not being used in a way of saying, hey, here's this, now come join us. It's get here, and this is what we have lined up. And maybe that seems like, shades of gray, but I don't think it is. I think it is an important distinction. But clearly they're realizing that they can do both. And there's very few places in the country. And this was what I think most people believed from the start, was when NIL became a reality, people believed that the big fish are going to get even bigger. And I think that you will see more and more in the transfer portal when there are these elite players, these highly coveted guys. If the big schools, if Ohio State's, if Georgia's, Alabama's want them, they're going to get them. And that's the reality.
It does feel like, I mean, we don't need to have another prolonged NIL conversation, but I guess I will just say this. Like, I sense a fair amount of confidence from Ohio State that they have found their footing a little bit. Now, does that mean they're going to be in the upper echelon, 7-figure kind of stuff that gets thrown around out there? I don't know, but I think that they felt the brunt of not even being able to keep up in more of that kind of middle ground, or maybe the tier just below that in the last recruiting cycle, and feel like they might have gotten something figured out here. We'll see how it goes with the remainder of the 2024 recruiting class, but I would kind of lump this edition in with that almost. And I feel like this is a step in the right direction for the program in terms of maintaining competitiveness on that level. And as you said, when you combine it with everything else that Ohio State has to offer, and like if Alabama and Georgia and I guess like USC to a lesser extent are also doing similar things, I don't see any other scenario than those programs just becoming better and separating themselves from the field even more. So it's a good position for Ohio State to be in. Did you where was defensive tackle for you coming out of spring in terms of like, oh, they need to go add a guy? Is this like a luxury move for you? Is this more of a, we need to make sure that our numbers don't completely get depleted after this season kind of move? Like how does this, I guess, resonate with you in terms of how it impacts the roster?
You and I kind of talked about the need for a defensive tackle a few weeks ago, and I thought then that the idea of adding someone like Malone is valuable because what you said on the Wednesday morning of the edition of the Daily, talking about Davison Igbinosun, there is the opportunity to get multiple years out of Malone here, and that is important because heading into spring, I thought, hey, a defensive tackle is a big need, right? Coming out of spring, I didn't think it was as big a need for the 2023 season because we saw Hero Kanu really start to step up. We've seen a healthy Michael Hall. We continue to see growth out of Ty Hamilton. If Tyleik Williams is able to contribute at all, then you have, with those four guys, a really, I think, solid front four. But then you also have Jason Moore, who is like 295 pounds now at 6'6.5". He's different. And Caden McDonald, who, as we've talked about over and over on this show and others, like I really believe Caden McDonald is going to be hard to keep off the field once he gets his feet settled in Columbus. So now you have 7 defensive tackles when you add in a guy like Tywone Malone, who I think can play. That maybe makes him a luxury for the 2023 season. But as we talked about on Wednesday's show, if Michael Hall goes out and stays healthy, he's gone after this season. There's no doubt about it. Mm-hmm. He's gone after this season. Tyleik Williams, whether or not he's the best version of himself or even what he's been in the last few years, you just get the sense that he will test the waters if he can, if he's healthy enough to do that. That's just sort of the vibe, right? So
yeah.
Then you have Ty Hamilton, who's going into his fourth year. So he could leave after this year. All of a sudden, then you're looking at a much different room heading into 2024, and that's where someone like Tywone Malone has a lot of value. And when you talk about need versus a depth piece, I think maybe he's a little bit of both. But the reality is, high ceiling potential-wise, he is as good as Michael Hall when you're talking about what he can be on the field for Ohio State. Now, is that a fair expectation in his first year in Columbus? Probably not. But he was the number 11 ranked defensive tackle in the country coming out of high school, the number 1 ranked player in the state of New Jersey. He probably would have been ranked higher at defensive tackle if he was fully committed to playing football and not splitting his time. So, I mean, comes from a really good program at Bergen Catholic in New Jersey. Like, this is a kid who's going to be able to make an impact right away, but you don't think you're going to have to worry about him leaving after 1 year.
He does have, I was double checking this as you were talking. So he only appeared in 1 game in 2021. So he preserved his red shirt that year. So he does have 3 years of eligibility remaining. If he reaches his potential, I can't envision a scenario where he uses all of that in Columbus. And frankly, Ohio State probably hopes that he does reach his potential to the point that he doesn't use all of that in Columbus. But I think you're a really, really good shot of getting at least 2 years out of a guy who could be a very talented defensive tackle by the time his career is over. And it it puts the defensive line in an interesting position for me because like we've seen in the past that they've had defensive ends, like a deep enough defensive end room where they can just like keep coming at you in waves and pull guys off the field, put new guys on, and nothing seems to change. I don't know if they've always had that or really have ever had that at defensive tackle. It always feels like there's like 2 or 3 tackles, and some years there's like 5 or 6 ends. And coming into this year or coming into the spring, I thought they probably have 3 tackles. If Tyleik Williams can find another gear, then they definitely have 3 tackles. But now you add Tywone Malone into this. You mentioned Caden McDonald, Jason Moore. Like it almost feels, not to make it like a lazy comparison, but it does feel a little like Georgia like to me in the way that that program builds out its defensive line where it has like a dozen players it can throw out there with no drop off. And that's the reason why they're so difficult to beat. And it makes me wonder if Ohio State's trying to copy that recipe at all, especially with the defensive tackle position, because this to me feels a little different than maybe how they've done it in the past, where especially if Jason Moore and Caden McDonald like hit early, you're talking about 5, 6, 7 defensive tackles that I think all reasonably have a pretty good chance of playing this fall.
Yeah, and I think the real added value or value added with a guy like Tywone Malone is, as we said, he's playing a 3-4 defensive end the last 2 years. Ohio State loves to have that bigger defensive end out there. If you could put a guy like that on the opposite side of JT Tuimoloau and keep Michael Hall and Ty Hamilton on the field at the same time, you got a much different, very stout run-stopping type defensive line. And then if you had a guy like Jason Moore, I mean, you know, Ohio State's done that Rushman package the last few years where you have 4 defensive ends. Like there's an opportunity to put in 4 defensive tackles out there at one time, and they're not unathletic defensive tackles. I mean, you're talking 6'6", 295, like in Jason Moore on one side, and 6'5", 305-pound Hero Kanu on the other side. I mean, you can do a lot of things here, and I do think that Larry Johnson for the last 5-6 years has tried to go away from, you know, what I would call true defensive ends or true defensive tackles. He wants 6'5", 285 across the line. Like that's the goal. If you can find that sort of dude and just stack those guys on top of each other that can play the end, can play the middle, can pass rush, can run stop, like then that's what you want. And certainly it does feel like it's a little inverted with this current group, but the versatility of a guy like Malone, because he does have that length that you already described and the ability to play outside, it does make me wonder, knowing that there is a question mark after Tuimoloau at defensive end with a lot of unproven guys behind him. Does that open a door for Malone to play that spot as well? Like, I mean, how does that change things, and how does this interfere with the plans to deploy Mitchell Melton at the jack, or they have a lot of parts, and I think the real interesting thing for Ohio State from here until August 1 is how they figure out how to use them all, because there are a lot of different pieces.
Yeah, there are, and it does. I also wonder too, like with Tywone Malone coming out of the system he came out of at Ole Miss, like I'd imagine he'd have to do like a decent amount of like 2 gapping and just a 3 down front, and that's not what Larry Johnson does, but I think it's kind of what Jim Knowles would like to be able to do sometimes. And I think you need different body types maybe to do that than what Ohio State has had traditionally at defensive tackle. I think Tywone is that. I think Caden McDonald is that as a 300-pounder. Tyleik Williams could be that. Hero Kanu can certainly be that. So I think it gives them some versatility to do some different stuff up front. And like I was already pretty bullish on the defense going into next year, and in particular the defensive line. And this just makes it more so. Like I really do think, not to get too far over my skis, but I really do think we're perhaps entering or getting back to seeing an Ohio State defensive line that like you just feel for the entirety of a game, and like that is their calling card, and they just keep coming after you, and there's nothing you can do about it. And it's totally overwhelming to the point that, you know, eventually that the offense you're going against just gives in. So yeah, I don't know. Like I think it would be great if they can get back to that. And it seems like they're taking the steps too.
And coming from an SEC program, you know you're going to get a guy who does not need to be taught how to work in the weight room. That sort of stuff is a given with Tywone Malone. He's also, and I know it's baseball, but he's on the national championship baseball team at Ole Miss. Like he understands what you need to do to win, and what it means to be a piece of a bigger puzzle. As you mentioned, he only had 12 at bats in 2 years for the Rebels on the baseball team, baseball diamond, but like that matters. He's got a national championship ring, and you can't really discount that. And I also think if you're an Ohio State fan and you're just looking for, something to gloat about, like Chris Partridge, the new return assistant at the University of Michigan, who was a defensive coach at Ole Miss, who recruited both Davis Igbinosun and Tywone Malone from the transfer portal to try to get them to Michigan, and he was the New Jersey recruiter for both those guys in high school. Tried to get both of them to Michigan, and Ohio State won both those battles. So, I mean, if we're going back to the, has Ohio State figured things out in the transfer portal and NIL and how to balance this and that? I think it's pretty clear they have, because those pre-existing relationships, Ohio State had them with Larry Johnson and Tywone Malone, but clearly Chris Partridge at Michigan had them by being their assistant coach at Ole Miss and recruiting them out of high school for Michigan, and Ohio State won them both. So that's something to, I guess, feel slightly good about if you're one of those Buckeyes fans who's looking for something to feel good about on this Thursday morning.
Yeah, nice cherry on top there, I think, for an otherwise strong recruiting win for Ohio State. Probably it should be the last edition.
Sure hope so.
And the transfer portal is closed, even though stuff still is happening. We talked earlier in the week about the Jalen Key, the safety from UAB, and he announced that he was kind of taking Ohio State out of consideration. It was down to 3 other schools, so that ship seems to have sailed, and there's really nobody else, I think, to keep an eye on. So I think the roster is more or less set. Certainly, if other things happen, we will discuss them here on the podcast daily and write about them over at ohiostate.rivals.com. Thank you for listening to this episode of The Daily. For Berm, I am Bill. We'll talk to you guys tomorrow.